The Reckoning Dollar was Fenmilai by Luzin Stag and Wendelle C. Stevens. Information translated from Swiss by Luzin Stag. Photos by Permelson of Edward Meier. The beautiful disc-shaped craft landed and a human-looking cosmonaut disembarked and approached the witness. Cosmonaut, you are a fearless man. Edward Meier, I forgot to be afraid as I watching that machine. Cosmonaut, that is why we have been observing you a number of years. Edward Meier, ah, so. And, why me, may I be permitted to ask? Cosmonaut, why you? I will explain something to you. Edward Meier, I have no power or authority to do anything for you. Cosmonaut, certainly we would not have selected you and guided your interest in questions of this nature, telepathy, UFOs, etc., if you were not honest and sincere. Edward Meier, thank you for the compliment. Cosmonaut, nothing special. You have earned it? Edward Meier, thanks, and whom may I be addressing? Cosmonaut, a being with interests like yours. My name is Sem Jace. I come from the Pleiades. Edward Meier, the Seven Sisters? Cosmonaut, yes. Edward Meier, truly a flight beyond comprehension. How is it possible? Do you travel ultradimensionally? Cosmonaut, you know much. Edward Meier, Sem Jace, why don't you take me to your ship, so that I may take a picture up close? Or will my film be ruined? Cosmonaut, naturally you must have good photographs to prove our meeting. Edward Meier, is it alright if I make this public? How should I comport myself in this? Cosmonaut, as you think best. You shall obtain more later. Edward Meier, very good. Sem Jace, is it not dangerous to leave the ship parked like that, in the open? LT is such an attractive object. Cosmonaut, do not worry. We have provided AOINS that no one can owe it within 100 meters 6 TTNE craft. And it is out DT signed behind the trees and the hill. That was the beginning of an hour-long conversation in flawless local dialect that took place between a UFO occupant and Mr. Edward Meier in a secluded meadow surrounded by trees near Hinwil, Canton Zurich, Switzerland. Mr. Meier is reluctant to discuss all of the conversation at this time because was Pete Argosy UFO visits of an extraterrestrial spaceship to the wooded countryside near Hinwil. We present the details of the first visit and an example of the photographs made by the principal witness. Mr. Edward Meier. Mr. Meier, now 39, an ex-truck driver and one-time racing car driver, lost an arm in an automobile accident in Turkey, and has to operate his camera, a Japanese Olympus CR, 35mm handheld model with a defective viewfinder and focus that cannot be changed. With this handicap, no small feat in itself. He was always interested in metaphysics and the possibility of communication with realms of being beyond the physical. He investigated spiritualism and tried various methods of telepathy, seeking some form of direct conjugation, and was using the same method. The first result was weak and indistinct. But voices could definitely be heard. On the second attempt, he heard a definite message instructing him to take a camera and QO out immediately. LT was a gentle commandee, and he complied with it. He took the camera, went out and got on his moped. He had no idea where he was going, but he seemed to be guided by an inner voice. LT was almost 1 o'clock. He rode down the road, through the small village of Hinwil and out into the wooded countryside to an unpopulated area. There was only an old truck stopped in a path off the road. As he passed it, he stopped to look at the license tag and observed that it was German, and thought that the driver must be in the woods. LT was exactly 2:12. He had been riding for about an hour. He looked up at the overcast sky. Suddenly, he was surprised to hear a humming sound and, looking in that direction, saw a strange circular machine shoot out from the clouds and begin slowing down. As it slowed, the humming ceased. The marvelous craft was disc-shaped and it advanced in a curve toward the witness. LT was about 350 meters away. Meier raised his camera to frame the machine, hoping to get a picture of it as it flew over, and snapped the first shot at about 2:15 when the object was about 150 meters away and 150 meters above the ground. As soon as he snapped head and spetting sound residential larate. Almost immediately, the disc-shaped craft returned at high speed and slowed to a hover over the truck. Meier took the second photograph and noted that the time was 2:18. He was absolutely certain that he had seen and photographed a real UFO. Interested, he observed the object with careful attention. G lower part of the circular craft, below the disc flange, vibrated rapidly in a steady small wave motion from the center disc to the rim of the flange. Perhaps the unknown energy source modified or appeared to modify the apparently solid surface to produce the wave effect. He also noticed that heat was radiating from the object. In a moment, the object, balancino on air over the truck, sped off again at a high velocity, disappearing in the sky to the east. The humming ceased and the place returned to silence. Meier turned his bicycle around and proceeded eastward along the edge of the woods. He dismounted and continued afoot, excitedly turning the events of the experience over in his mind, trying to organize them exactly as they had happened. He came to a clearing where he saw 5 roe deer grazing peacefully. Beyond them, among the fir, birch, and beech trees, crows were battling some other birds of prey. Then something happened to break the tranquility of the scene. The birds suddenly abandoned the clearing and the deer became nervous, raising their heads and looking around, as if they sensed danger in the wind. Running rapidly, with long, bounding leaps, they disappeared into the distant trees. 2 or 3 minutes passed, and then this photograph of SEM-JACE's UFO was taken by Edward Meier on January 28, 1975. Began to hear T.he humming sound again. Suddenly the strange craft shot in from the east and circled over the woods as it slowed down. As the humming diminished this time I understood the strange behavior of the animals. Evidently they had somehow become aware of the presence before it appeared overhead. The object curved over the trees towards the clearing and settled gently on the grass. I hurriedly snapped another picture as it was coming down. LT was 2:31. LT made its landing softly and without a stir near the trees. As soon as it landed, L, full of curiosity, ran toward it to get closer and possibly photograph it then. But, about 100 meters from the object, this was the first shot of SEM-JACE's extraterrestrial vehicle, taken by Edward Meier, just after sighting the UFO. Halted by a force of some kind. LT was like advancing against a flexible barrier or strong current, or like opposing strong like polarities of a magnet. I used all my strength to overcome the obstacle, but it was not enough. LT was impossible to advance, and I thought that, whatever it was, it certainly protected the object. LT was no illusion. Then, from behind the UFO came a figure. She was wearing a silver-gray coverall smithing like our space pilots use, only it did not appear cumbersome. LT seemed very light and flexible, like something our space suits might evolve to. LT gave the impression of being very durable. LT had a firm ring around the neck, evidently for attaching a helmet, though at the moment she was not wearing one. Her head was bare. The being came toward me slowly and I noticed that it had a feminine walk. The pilot had about her an extraordinary human appearance. Her movements were graceful and direct, indicating quiet command and perfect control. An inner assurance of confidence. She was entirely feminine. When she came up to me, she took me by the arm and I raised off the ground, as if I had no weight. Her grip was firm but not annoying. Slowly she led me toward my bicycle as she began addressing me in perfect German without accent. They ARGOSY UFO changed pleasantries and conversed until 3:15. We stood and walked for a time, and then for lack of a bench sat in the dry grass of the meadow. During the discussion, which lasted about an hour and 10 minutes, Meier learned that his visitor's name was SEM-JACE, and that she said she came from the Pleiades. She invited him to visit her native planet, which she did not name, but she said that her home country was something like that of the lower Swiss Alps, for which reason she liked that area. She said that they had been planning this contact for a long time to develop a voice channel for Earth humanity, to help humans out of their ignorance of so many things. From this time on, Meier could serve as a direct communication channel with them for our public. Sem Jace left him at 3:58, indicating that he might take another photo of her spacecraft while she flew RT around a tree. Then she reboarded her ship. He could barely see the craft, when it sent in his direction a radiation like a heat flare, which seemed to alter its form momentarily and then disappeared. The craft began to move. A reddish-blue color appeared to be emitted around the perimeter of the craft as it rose from the ground. He took another photograph. Then Sem Jace returned again with the spacecraft and flew a circle around it as follows. LN Part 1 of this ARGOSY UFO series, we learned that Mr. Meier had his first experience with a UFO on June 2, 1942, when he was 5 years old. His father, who also witnessed the UFO, only shook his head in disbelief, saying that it must be one of those new German weapons. When he began to hear voices in his head, he went to see his parson, who fortunately was aware of telepathy and extra-physical communication, and explained it, saying there was nothing to fear. The wise old Minis, Ter said his secret was safe and explained that he would interpret certain things. However, Meier would have to keep it to himself because Meier snapped this shot of the UFO as it was about to settle in a field nearby. 38 These things did not fit into his preaching profession. His was the task, he said, to fill his job as a parson in his community, while trying to carefully introduce his church members to the real truth about religion. This, he added, was an extremely difficult and delicate task, since the people in this community were especially God-fearing and, therefore, also superstitious. Part 2 The disclosures of my old minister made sense to me, even though I received a blow when he added that MV life was to be extremely hard, rich in self-denial and misery. Up to date, this has been true. His explanation also helped me to overcome my unfounded fears, and I started to expand the hitherto one-sided telepathic contact. I began to ask questions and I got answers. So I knew that the old Reverend had told me the truth. Through the means of telepathic conversations with a human entity, I now started receiving exceptional and, to me, overpowering information, which often sounded like pure madness. He called himself Svath. As a consequence, I became involved in Thanos, which isolated me completely from my surroundings. As time went on, I learned, however, to bear with apathy every kind of vicious attack and intrigue, and I let it even happen that I became the scapegoat for every evil doing in the village. I took no longer notice of what went on around me, and finally, I learned to smile inwardly when I had to suffer for things I had never committed. Often I got such hard beating that it was difficult for me to sit down or to stand up at school. There, the situation got worse and worse, and I started playing he truant. This had no serious consequences for my education, because what I learned at school was enlarged and deepened in the lessons I got through telepathy from Svath. Despite my school absences, which amounted to 173 days in one particular year, the school authorities did nothing about it for years, which was really astonishing. On the contrary, I felt that my teachers preferred things to run as they did until I had nearly finished my school terms. Only then, 6 months before the last day at school, they got at me. However, as those things influenced my life only for a short episode and had no consequences in my later development, I shall not give any more details here. So it happened in 1944 that Svath took up telepathic contact with me because I now was ready for reception, thanks to my minister's explanatory help. Yet, I was still in ignorance of the fact that Svath was the very man who, at an earlier time, had taken me aboard his pear-shaped flying machine. He now started, through telepathy, to explain to me that I was being trained for an enormous and extreme important task, and that it was up to me to decide whether I would be able to bear the weight of such a mission, or not. He told me that already at my birth I had been chosen for this specific task and that I had been under control ever since. To prove his point, he asked me if I remembered that at the age of 6 months I had passed through a very bad pneumonia and that I had been given up by the family doctor who, late at night, had told my parents that there was nothing more that he could do and that I would not recover. In the same night, so Sfoth said, he himself came to my help and gave me back to life. Of course, I wanted to check on this information and asked my mother. To my astonishment, she confirmed the story and she even recalled ARGOSY UFO how, when I recovered unexpectedly, they had spoken of a miracle. This was also what the doctor said, who had seen no human possibility to pull me through. Following his diagnosis, I should have died the next morning. Sfoth continued to give me information and he even told me certain facts which I am not allowed to disclose to anybody. And there came a day when I took another walk through the Horagenwald near Bulak. While idly strolling along, Sfoth announced himself suddenly in his usual telepathic way. He told me to wait and not to be afraid. I stood waiting for things to happen and it did not take long. After a few minutes a silver-colored object fell from the sky, still looking kind of funny to me, although well familiar. I estimated its diameter at about 5 to 6 meters. I looked on in fascination when the pear-shaped object settled on the ground, not far away from me. A kind of opening showed on its side and out stepped a human figure, a very old man. As he walked up to me I noticed his unusual dress. LT was a kind of diver's suit, silvery in aspect, with the head part missing. His countenance was that of I remember that he reminded me of a patriarch. His gait was rather clumsy as he approached and started talking. He addressed me in my mother tongue, the local Swiss dialect, which seemed to give him some difficulty. He told me Thatlra was Sfoth, my teacher, and that I should follow him to the ship. I did so, but not without some apprehension. We walked toward the pear-shaped object and I was heaved up into it through the opening, without knowing exactly what it was that lifted me up. The door closed behind us, venerable and wise personality, and automatically and Sfoth took me through another opening into a small room in which 3 seats were standing. The walls, as well as an unusual kind of desk, were fully covered with knobs and implements. I also noticed some sort of small windows in which unfamiliar figures were moving around, and in some of them I saw the familiar landscape and my village. Sfoth asked me to take a seat and started manipulating one of the appliances. Failed to understand what he did. But I suddenly realized that the landscape began to change. I now saw it from a bird's eye view only, and Sfoth explained that we were no above 70 kilometers above Earth. He also told me that these windows were in fact a kind of vision screen which was about to be developed now on Earth also. He explained it as a picture remission by using a certain form of energy. He also said that we would now stay for a few hours at this height because he wanted to give me some important information. I now learned that, due to his efforts, my mind had grown into one of a $3-year-old human. He seemed to be satisfied with this and said my spiritual standard was such that I could not expect to learn anything more from people on Earth. Interestingly enough, I had no fear whatsoever when I learned how high up we were. I felt no surprise, but, on the contrary, I had a vague feeling of a familiar situation and I stopped wondering at Sfoth's pronouncements. And it was in a stoic mood that I accepted the information that Sfoth would be my guardian no longer than into the 50s, when he would pass on his task to a much higher evolved person. His time was running out, he said, and I would need instructions from a much higher 40 educated person anyway. He also told me that humanity was in for a very dangerous period and that the still raging World War LL would come to an end in 1945. He spoke of a coming disaster comparable to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And nobody could deny that the oncoming atomic warfare was why he had in mind. He gave me much more information which I am not allowed to give away. Sfoth had never told me his age, but I estimated it at least to be 90 or even 95. Neither did he ever speak of his origin or did he ever give me specifications of my own task awaiting me. This I only learned some tens of years later and from another source. In the meantime, I had to go through some tough experiences which drove me nearly mad, and I also faced death several times. But somehow I managed to overcome all difficulties and dangers. On the very few times I had to accept help from the outside, and today I am conscious of the fact that each time I got help from the outside some extraterrestrial agency must have been involved. But, on the whole, I was completely on my own and had to manage my life and to carry out my work as best as I could. LT was a long episode in which I learned a lot and was taught how to master every situation. My sojourn in the ship this particular day was of a duration of 4 hours. Toward the end of this most informative and stirring experience, Sfoth asked me to lay back in my chair, whereupon he started to place a singular contraption around my head, an appliance with innumerable wires and small pieces attached. Wonderino at what was uno on. I kept calm and obs6 rved Sfoth's manipulations of knobs and switches. Suddenly, something strange happened. I was able to see and hear overwhelming things in my head. They seemed to become clearer and simpler all the time, and all of a sudden, I felt an enormous amount of knowledge and perception manifest inside my brain. A most unusual kind of energy welled up in me. After a few moments I even was able to perceive things and events of the future and to realize how, in time, I would try to heal sick people with this strange force. But, as soon as Sfoth started to remove this unfamiliar headgear, the incoming flow of energy stopped. He told me that, from now on, I was in possession of all the faculties which the appliance had instilled but which, in fact, had been developed inside me already during an earlier epoch. He assured me that never again would I lose them, but that the condition was never to use them for egotistical aims or for showing off. All the knowledge accumulated would be at my disposal. Onl for MV own spiritual evolution and Lord THB fulfillment of my mission. LF, at any time, Puri would try to use imposes, their wow planted break, be the moment of danger old also work in case of scientific tests carried out T in this photo taken in Barrettsville, Switzerland, on March 3, 1975, Edward Meier captured 2 UFOs in flight. I on me or against other outside influences like hypnosis. The talkage would start working instantly and prevent any achievement. LT might be so forceful that it could hurt or endanger people who tried to enter my consciousness by force. This proved to be true in the future. After these last informations, Sfoth brought me back to the very spot where we had started exactly 4 hours earlier. He then disappeared in his pear-shaped ship and I never saw him again. Only his voice kept coming through for the next few veers. Brinoino some kind of new and startling knowledge 6 time. LT was on the 3rd of February, 1953, that he took leave for good. His voice had a tired and exhausted ring. I never heard him again. But, only a few hours after Sfoth's voice had left me forever, a new voice came through. Like Sfoth's, this voice was suddenly here and addressed me distinctly. But I noticed at once that it came from a young and strong organ, full of energy and, unlike the voice of Sfoth, soft and harmonious. After a while, I was informed that it came from a she, that her name was Asket and that from now on she would be my mentor. Through her, my second contact, I learned a lot of things and received some kind of phenomenal knowledge, or so it seemed to me at that time. And it was Asket who, in due time, made it possible for me to travel worldwide for a few 2 short years so I could start my own research work and grow in perception. ARGOSY UFO. That concludes the biographical information useful in explaining Mr. Meier's UFO contacts in this series. The second meeting with Sem Jace took place almost 1 month later, on February 27, near Wetzikon, where 2 different types of spacecraft appeared. We hope to cover that landing in detail in the next issue of this magazine. A photograph from that visit, showing the 2 types of spacecraft, is included here for your inspection. We are working on translation of the first 15 conversations with Sem Jace and expect to bring you some of this in the next installment in this series. Other subjects of interest will include, why Meier was chosen. What happens if he takes any other person to the contact? Our security measures during contact. Oh, what other witnesses can perceive when they accompany Meier. Oh, how the spacecraft are controlled. Oh, other human races in our universe. Oh, who sem jaces. Oh, ray ships. Oh, scout ships. Oh, telemeter discs. Oh, spaceships. In the next issue, we will report several of the next contacts by these beings with Mr. Meier and show actual photos from each of these contacts. 41 Madame Zero and the Rekonin $0 was Fenmina.